Tell us your position and where you work.
So I am the privacy and security lead for Mozilla's mixed reality projects. I work in Pittsburgh remotely for Firefox Reality team for Mozilla. Um, and basically, it's my job to think of all of the emerging threats that are happening with virtual reality, augmented reality, anything in between, because it turns out that there are a lot of emerging privacy threats.
You wrote this blog post in December. You did such a great job explaining what's going on specifically with Quest, right?
Yeah.
So explain the blog post a little bit, and then I'm going to ask you a couple specific questions about some of the
Mhm.
things you had in that.
Part of Mozilla's brand promise is we are all about privacy. And what that means is that part of our ethos and part of our privacy policy is that um, we don't want to be selling our users' data, and we don't want to, and so we want to make sure that we can interoperate with other products, other platforms like Oculus and like Facebook, while still remaining true to our privacy policies. Um, and so I was investigating, what is happening on the Oculus when you're doing routine browsing, for our knowledge for our products. And so I was curious, what kinds of data is sent back to Oculus during a routine browsing session. And that's where this all sort of came out from. Because Oculus, in their privacy policy, reserves the right to pretty much send back any data they want to. Whether that's VR specific data like your head pose, your voice, et cetera, or whether it's normal telemetry data and timing data. And the result of this was that although they reserve the right to send back this data, currently they're only sending back normal telemetry and timing data like URL data, time to interactive, et cetera. So what we would consider run-of-the-mill telemetry data.
One of the key things in that blog post was you explained the difference between collecting and processing, I think were the two terms. Can you explain
Yes.
the difference between those two terms and what they mean? And specifically, people would see these terms in privacy policies typically.
Processing is something that is necessary, especially when we're talking about mixed reality. Like right now, you're processing what I'm doing with my hands. You have to process what I'm doing with my hands in order to say that I'm moving my hands like a crazy person, which is what I do when I talk. But what you probably aren't doing is collecting my hand data right now. You aren't collecting it and storing it for later use or later processing. So processing is kind of this transient data process. Shouldn't use processing. It's this transient operation on the data where the data goes in, you do something to it, and then the data goes back out again. Whereas in collection, the data goes in, it's kind of stored in this box, and it might also go out again and be used, but it also stays in that box for later use, maybe for advertising.
What can people do to affect change here? And what's the sort of red flags that people should keep an eye out for?
One of the things that I push really hard back against is that I know that individuals want to do things. Individuals want to be able to affect change, but what we really need is a collective. What we really need is collective action. Because the companies are the ones with all of the power here. The companies force the privacy policies, and you either use the technology and you are bound by the terms of the contract that you implicitly agree to, or you don't use the technology and therefore you aren't bound to it, right? That's the reality of the situation that we're in. So what you can do, now there are other headsets, like what's it called? Pico, I think is what it's called. Now they're supposed to be a more privacy preserving headset because they're geared more towards enterprise use. So enterprise use has more of a less of a, what's the word I'm looking for? less of an incentive to sell towards advertisers because they're making their money off of enterprise deals, right? So you can look at the incentive structures and try to purchase your hardware based on that. So that's one option that you can do. But unfortunately, due to contracts of adhesion, there's not much as the individual that you can do. One thing that you can do is try to, we're trying to put together, what are reasonable policy proposals? What are things that we can do that people can support and try to get their Congress people to support?
I watched the evolution of what happened with the app stores, where when the iPhone App Store first debuted, a lot of those apps were $10, $15 a piece. Mm-hmm. And, I think it bears mentioning that, Oculus Quest apps are all between $10 and, $30 right now. So you're paying for an experience and you're expecting to get an experience out of that you paid for up front, and not to have any collection of personal data, in response to that. I'm paying a premium, so to speak, in order for that to be done. But to the sort of point, I guess the broader point here is Facebook wouldn't want to, or any company, I hate to focus just on Facebook, and there's a comment here asking whether there's a bias against Facebook here in focusing on their specific business model, and since there's so much fear of the company in general. But they would not want to restrict a future revenue stream, or if their business shifts, they're going to want to protect and make sure that their business has a 10-year lifespan. It can grow over the span of many years and can go in different areas. So I guess I'm going to rephrase this into a different perspective. Is there anyone doing really simple language privacy policies that are easily understandable by 13-year-olds who are at the beginning of who are using these things in many cases, that we can point to and say, all privacy policies should be written this way?
No. No, and you're not going to get that, because privacy policies are legal documents. And so they're going to be written by lawyers. And, my mom's a lawyer, and I can tell you right now, nothing she writes is going to be comprehensible to a 13-year-old. But you make a good point. So one thing that we do need to think about is the types of compensation models. Advertising as a compensation model, I think we've noticed, isn't a compensation model that incentivizes privacy. Now, there are actually, but on the other hand, there are ways that we can enable advertising while respecting privacy. And one of my favorite things to pick on, and it's weird that I both pick on it and kind of advocate for it, it's gaze. So our gaze can reveal a lot of different things about us. It can reveal our sexual orientation. It can reveal, keep trying to enumerate on my fingers and forgetting. It can reveal things like our sexual orientation. It can reveal whether we have affective disorders like autism. Oh, that's not an affective disorder, apologies. It can reveal whether we have autism. It can reveal affective disorders like anxiety or depression. All sorts of things that are either protected information or sensitive information. And so exposing raw gaze data, especially to something like the immersive web, is something that I advocate very strongly against. However, exposing gaze data in very abstracted ways could also be very attractive, especially if we're doing advertising in a privacy protecting way. Like if you expose gaze data in a way that says someone has interacted with this ad, they've engaged with this ad, i.e. they've looked at it, then an advertiser can pay out and have more confidence that someone has actually engaged with this ad without requiring all of the tracking, without requiring all this cross-site tracking that we see now. And so it's a way to do engagement without requiring all the tracking, without requiring all of this privacy violating technology that we see. And so it's one of those things that in privacy, everything is context dependent. There are no right and wrong answers. And I think that that's what makes it really hard.
I want to illuminate and really raise the level of understanding of these very hard to grasp technologies. And the magic of VR is that it disappears, right? The technology is disappearing in front of your eyes. The latest technology for Quest is to remove the controllers themselves and just to reach out with your own bare hands into midair to manipulate content. And so it's just one more layer of this technology literally disappearing right before your eyes, and you're just being there. And it becomes really important to understand what these words mean, how they can be used, and to start discussions about policy and about what these companies can be doing better. I think the flip side of that is what you said at the beginning of this, where processing the data is necessary for function on so many levels, and I don't think it's just not really well understood where collection ends and where processing begins, and I don't know how we can illuminate that more. And one of the comments here was bringing up decentralized VR, and I guess it's an interesting idea, but I don't understand how we would get to decentralized VR. And I mean, there's ideas of like blockchains being used to distribute ownership in a different way, but it's always, when you get into discussions of blockchains, you end up going down a real deep rabbit hole of things that it could do that it will probably never do.
If you look at, say, Bitcoin, which is, the kind of quintessential blockchain, it's, people think of blockchain as anonymous technology. And one of my favorite quotes about Bitcoin is that it's just Twitter for your bank account. It's not actually anonymous. There's a lot of work that you have to do in order to make it anonymous.
And I love that breakdown. That's fantastic. Yeah.
And so I think that you have to take a really good look at the guarantees that you want to get out of it. Like saying that you want something that's decentralized. One of the things that you have to look at, we're not saying, oh, what'll solve all of our problems is decentralized VR. No, what are the guarantees that we're actually looking to get? Is it anonymity? Is it the lack of a centralized infrastructure? Is it the absence of Facebook? And from there, then you can start thinking about, okay, well, what actually solves the problems here? And so that's mainly my problem when we talk about decentralization, is that I think that we say decentralization before we talk about the actual guarantees we're looking for.
Machine learning is sort of the latest frontier in technology, and I guess I'm trying to understand we put this video out on YouTube, right? What's keeping people from inferring all those things earlier that you talked about just by looking at our video? Finding our video and seeing our gaze and seeing the movements of our hands and producing a pretty good model of who we are just from these avatars.
What's keeping them from doing it right now is pretty much that people haven't done it yet. And when they do, they'll write a paper and they'll probably put a positive spin on it. And then privacy advocates will be like, you know what? That was a terrible idea. You shouldn't have. It was a terrible idea. You should put a negative spin on this. This is a total privacy violation. But, it's something that I am working on. I'm actively working on trying to get collaborations for, can we link avatars from like this, this experience to another experience. I'm looking for collaborators. I'm interested in collaborations. Can we link people identities from one experience to another based on things like, hand tracking based on their gait, things like this. Can we connect people based on these biometrically derived data, what I cleverly call BDD, because it's not technically biometrics. Illinois has a biometrics law that very narrowly defines biometrics as things like your face scan, retinal scans, fingerprints, etc. And so this really is what we're talking about. It's biometrically derived data because it is intrinsic to you, but it's more derived, right? And so,
sorry, go ahead.
And so what I'm saying is that what's keeping people from doing it is that it hasn't been done yet. Now, there is something to be said for, there is a certain need for granularity. For example, right now, is this movement that I'm doing here, is this quite granular enough to identify me? I don't know. That's something that you would need to look into. Is this head movement that I'm doing, can you get this from a video? I don't know, but can you get it from the headset side of things if you have access to that? Probably.
I guess I should bring up a couple other things that I've talked to, but like I know Facebook has, they're working very hard with hyper realistic, what do they call them? They currently call them codec avatars, I believe, to really represent you in a much more realistic way. And I put one of these questions to Facebook, wondering, in their terms of use, they ask you that you use your real identity, your real name, in setting up a Facebook account. And now to access certain social features via Oculus headsets, you need to link your Facebook account to access those social features. And the problem with that whole policy is that it actually encourages people to set up more fake accounts, to get around having to give their data collection. So related to the codec avatar situation is that, we are, sometime down the road, it makes sense for the headset to authenticate the person putting the headset on as the owner of the headset. Theft protection, privacy protection, and in theory, making sure you can load up only your settings and your content and protect you in significant ways. Does that level of, I guess it's going back to the issue of this policy, does it encourage people to actually set up more fake accounts, and is that defeating the process? So what, is there a better solution out there than that?
There are a ton of problems with requiring real identity accounts, and especially for a social environment. Jessica Outlaw from The Extended Mind did a study where she found out that, within an hour, all of the women in her study felt uncomfortable in social VR. They felt harassed, and they felt generally uncomfortable, and they were more than ready to leave. I haven't done much in social VR outside of Hubs because I don't really have any interest in being harassed myself or feeling that way. And so I choose to do private by default instead of joining like the large, more open social VR settings. And that's my personal choice. But besides that, there are a lot of places where dissidents and others might want to not be represented by their real identities. I personally don't have a Facebook account. To do the Oculus testing, I wanted to see if there was a difference in the data that was sent back between not being logged into Facebook and being logged into Facebook. And so I actually created a Facebook account for my cat. And so my cat now has Facebook account. Sorry,
Fantastic.
Watson. Sorry, I've violated your privacy. So I now have a fake Facebook account for my cat to violate that, to do that. And so, but then, one of the other things that I do is a lot of ethics work. And is it ethical to require people to be realistic or be photorealistic? And I think that this Yeah, I think that we could talk for hours on this entire subject realistically. So I don't know if I'm even coming close to answering your question, but I think that there are a lot of problems with having a photorealistic avatar. Because, like, I know personally, I would much prefer to be realized in virtual reality as a cat. That's how I feel my intrinsic self is. Um,
So one of the best questions. So I was at one of the Oculus Connects, and there was a transgender person who came up and asked a social VR person at Facebook whether they would be allowed to use voice changing software or hardware to embody the gender that they identify with.
mhm.
Um, and whether that ran afoul of Facebook's identity policies. Um, and I don't think that question was answered then. And this was an Oculus Connect years ago. I don't think it's been answered now. And so it's an ongoing. So this conversation
Yeah.
can go on for hours, and I want to keep having this conversation. I'm so appreciative of you joining us today, to have that conversation, because these aren't easy answers. And politics is one of those things where um, the internet allows some of the least informed people to make the largest voice, to sort of make the biggest impact. And it doesn't allow for more nuanced discussion that really can result in, it doesn't always allow for more nuanced discussion that can result in actual policy change that meets the needs of a very large segment of people. The extremists come in and they push the people apart, and it becomes really hard to have these discussions. So we're doing our best to have these discussions, and to be able to apply deeper meaning, raise up the knowledge of our audience so that we can uh, discuss these things more in depth and understand what the solutions might be in a couple of years. And I appreciate everything we've talked about. So hopefully we can continue this discussion in the future.
I just want to finish up by saying that, privacy, I love working on privacy. I love working on emerging technology privacy. It's really hard because there's a technological part to it, but privacy inherently is about people. It's about having respect for people. It's about caring for people. It's, there's a policy component. You have to be aware of what's going on around you. And you have to be able to contextualize things, and you have to think about all of that. But it's really about the intersection of technology and people. And so thank you so much for having me on and letting me talk about this.
Well, thank you so much. And let's try our handshake here. Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for tuning in. And tune back in next week. We'll have a new guest, and we'll talk about the week's VR news. So thank you so much for joining us.